Good evening, everyone. We are continuing in our really wonderful journey through In Divine Friendship with Swami Kriyananda. So many wonderful meanings to that concept of divine friendship. Let's begin with a prayer, then we'll have a little chanting, a few moments of meditation, and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear Divine Friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, to be uplifted in your energy, to be guided by your wisdom, to be thrilled by your love. We are your children living in this world as best we are able, but without your guidance we are really lost and helpless. So make yourself known. Make us receptive. Help us to know that wanting your will is the surest road to happiness. Don't hide yourself from us. Make yourself very clear so that we may follow the path of light that you put before us to our eternal home with thee. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, now our friend Keshava will lead us in chanting.
Mother, come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of my secret soul. Mother, come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Mother, I give you my soul. Soul call. You can't remain hidden anymore. You can't remain hidden anymore. Give my mother a soul. She can't remain hidden anymore. She can't remain hidden anymore. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of my secret soul, Mother. Come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my secret soul, Mother. Come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Mother, I give you my soul, soul, soul. You can't remain hidden anymore. You can't remain hidden anymore. Give my mother a soul, soul, soul call. She can't remain hidden anymore. She can't remain hidden anymore. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of the silent sky. Come out of the mountain glen. Come out of my secret soul, Mother. Come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my secret soul, Mother. Come out of my secret soul. Come out of my cave of silence. Come out of my cave of silence. Mother, I give you my soul, soul, soul call. You can't remain hidden anymore. You can't remain hidden anymore. Give my mother a soul, soul, soul call. She can't remain hidden anymore. 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 You can't remain hidden anymore. One lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother. One lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. One lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother. One lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. What lightning flash glimmers in thy face, Mother, what lightning flash glimmers in thy face. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through and through. Seeing thee, I am thrilled through
Let's be silent now for a few minutes. All right, my friends, let's start in on this book again. So we're reading in the middle. We're in the section of the book called Ananda, and it has a sort of lot of, I don't want to use the word official, but the Swami's making a lot of big points here. So the letter we're working on was written in 1974, and a certain amount of what's written here is really historical, but some of it has value. We're right in the middle of a very long letter. What was going on in 1974 was the community started officially, we've decided, in 1969. The community is the area of Ananda in Nevada County, which is now called Ananda Village. And in order to have a community, you have to have people. And the idea of a community was not clearly defined. Now Ananda's become clearly defined. In the 1968, 69, it was not clearly defined. There was a lot of energy flowing around to make communities and communes and all of that sort of thing. So many people came to live at Ananda, were accepted to live at Ananda, but they had their own ideas about what a community should be. And among other ideas that they had was that the nature of a community is that everybody should have a voice in deciding what it should be. And Swamiji, however, had a very clear mandate from Master and a very clear vision of what he was trying to accomplish. And people came without much understanding of what Swami's intention was. Many of us were thrilled by Swami's energy, gradually began to understand it, and rose on the tide of his inspiration. But there were others who were good people, who just had other ideas, who weren't destined to be part of that. And at the beginning there was conflict over that. People somehow just felt they had a right, an equal right to say what Ananda ought to be. And Swamiji knew that that was never going to result in success. So people would be there for a few years and then become off sometimes quite irate because it wasn't turning out to be what they expected it to be. 1994, that was beginning to come to a head, and it increasingly came to a head until 1976. I thought I said 94, but 74. 1976, when that whole part of Ananda burned to the ground. And so most of the people who really had a different idea of what Ananda was supposed to be, when it ceased to be a physical place that was beautiful, that had a house in it that they could live in, Ananda didn't exist for them anymore. For those of us for whom Ananda was the ideal of serving Master, the loss of the physical place was definitely a setback, but it didn't really touch what Ananda was to us, because it was a non-physical reality that we were manifesting through a form, but the form was secondary to the spirit of it. So some woman has written Swamiji, and I don't know who these people were. My karma was, even though I was there during this period of time, I never had anything much to do with that whole group of people. I lived at the retreat and I lived at Ayodhya, there's 3 distinct places. And the village, which we called the farm at that time, had this group of people who are mostly more dissonant. And I never lived there, and I never had anything to do with them, so I have no idea who these people are. So Swami's continuing. He was answering her objections, and now we're simply continuing. We're right smack in the middle of the letter. So, and she had said, if you had only let these wonderful, hardworking, creative people do their thing in their way, they could have built a great community. Swami says, I don't think so. He said, I don't think they were the kind of people who really could have succeeded. And so they have a difference of opinion, the woman to whom he's writing in Swamiji. And so he had said earlier, I've never tried to discourage constructive action. Rather, I've always been eager to get people to take hold and do things. What I've always resisted has been the tendency prevalent in those days, meaning in the early days of the community, to paralyze constructive action of any kind. The most dynamic efforts of certain persons that I recall were directed towards removing their activities, such as they were, from under my control, a purely negative action, inasmuch as they needed only to step forward with positive ideas and positive energy to have had my support for almost anything they might have wanted to do. Ananda's broader history is full of examples of other people who set out to do something and then did it. At no time did such people find that the first step to creative action had to be the removal of Kriyananda from having any say in whatever they might do. That's the paragraph I read last week. Now we go on. But the, quote, creative people, unquote, you refer to never belonged in this category of members. Most certainly I resisted them. I knew their attitude would never carry them to success. Their very approach demonstrated their essential incompetence. Such people invariably are talkers, not doers. They'd have destroyed Ananda. He's very emphatic on that, isn't he? Talkers, not doers. Swami was right, too. If you had a positive, good idea, he was all for it. But some people just spent their time battling his authority rather than creatively doing what they felt like doing. Had those people truly been leaders and doers, they would have simply gone ahead and done. And that is one of the characteristics that I've learned from Swamiji, is that people who have good ideas and the ability to do them just generally just do them. They don't sit around talking about why other people won't let them do it. And in that case, I'd have supported them. But as it happened, I had only to open my mouth to suggest something quite innocuous for many of those enthusiastic, hard-working, that's quotes again, people, to object bitterly that I was dictating to them. Why on earth would I want to dedicate all my labors and the sacrifices of so many harmonious people to permitting such enthusiasts to do their own non-thing? Now, this is something that Swami's always stood for, and he says it later in this letter too. That you work with the people who have good energy. And good energy is positive. Now here he goes on and explains it a little bit more. Positive and dynamic, and makes things happen. You speak of the need for, quote, thinking opposition to keep an organization, quote, on its toes, unquote. This is a very common sort of, there's a whole lot of ideas that people put forward because other people say them without ever stopping to really think deeply about it. Thinking opposition. In my many years of religious work, I confess I know less about worldly organizations. I have never found constructive work proceeding out of a spirit of opposition. Out of differences, yes, but not out of opposition. And so that's sort of, he's making a very strong distinction. When people are essentially of one mind about what they're trying to do and harmonious in their spirit, they can have many different opinions, and that it does lead to a creative process. But when somebody appoints himself just to be the opposite voice no matter what, and then with a justification like, you know, you need somebody to constantly oppose your ideas. Let me just think for a second, there was a fleeting thought there. Oh yes, there was a man in the community. He actually lived in the community for 12 years. He refused to cooperate with any of the most basic rules of contribution. He never paid a penny, and he just felt like he didn't need to pay a penny. The rest of us, I mean, we worked collectively. We earned money in whatever ways we could. We contributed dues and rent. And it was just our way of working together to pay the mortgage. But this man just felt that his very presence was sufficient benefit to the community, and he never paid anything. He was a creative man, and Swami was hoping to win him to the cause, so he allowed it to go on for a long time. But finally, a particular manager said that he really felt that it was inappropriate, and with Swami's permission, he began to give this man ultimatums. And he was always oppositional. And he said that he felt that being a gadfly was very good for Ananda. It was very good to have someone who was always criticizing what we were doing. I mean, you can see how you can just sort of think that's a good idea, that I'll always be telling you that you're doing something wrong. And people confuse that with a clear-minded, discriminating capacity to help improve what we're doing. If you really are trying to help make something happen, then you tune into what it is and you try to move it forward. If your job is to be oppositional, you can always poke holes in something. Master said once, every building has a sewer, but when you go on a guided tour of a lovely structure, nobody takes you down into the sewer. Everybody knows it's there, but there's no need to just always be focusing on the lowest or everything that isn't working. That isn't really how positive constructive work is done. See, that's the mistake people have in their mind. I will constantly point out the problems, and some of that will help you. But that isn't how solutions are arrived at, and that isn't how superconscious work is done. Superconscious work is done by always being in a very positive flow of energy and seeing where we're going to be able to go instead of always trying to poke holes in it. So this man said that I'm the community gadfly and I think it's good for Ananda to have me. And the manager said to him, yes, but is it good for you? Is it good for you to always be complaining and harping and pointing out what's wrong and always thinking about what's wrong? And it wasn't good for him. And among the many reasons why he was given an ultimatum: either contribute the minimum that other people contribute or find another place to live. He decided to find another place to live. So, Swami says, it is interesting in this context to observe that since I assumed a more definite role of leadership in the community, in response, I should add, to the repeated pleas of most of the people here, I have had to involve myself far less in community decisions. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It is absolutely essential that we be of one mind on our basic principles and directions. Swamiji took a especially at the beginning, partly because he simply didn't have the support, because nobody knew what we were doing. But gradually over the years, many people came who were quite in tune with Swami's vision, and we asked him to please just take a stronger stand and don't be so accommodating of people whose views and intentions are quite different than what the majority of us now want. And when Swami really felt he had a majority commitment, at that point he began to assert his leadership. There was a key meeting. It happened very early on. It was the winter of 1971. Might have been past the new year, but I felt like it was in the fall of that year. I think I put this in Lightbearer, but not completely. I had just arrived. I arrived on June 1st, and I was there entirely because of Swami Kriyananda. And there had been this sort of conflict brewing between Swamiji and these people who just arrived and felt like they had an equal voice in everything that was happening. And Swamiji was given a large donation, and he wanted to use it to build what at that time was the publications building. That building has now become Hansa Temple, for those of you who know the village. But he built it to house the publications business. And he had let the people who lived in the farm area, the village area, to sort of do some land planning. He let people do as much as he felt they could do, even if they weren't that in tune with the vision, as long as it didn't undermine it. So he had let them do a lot of land planning, and the housing will be here and businesses here and so on. And so when he wanted to put up this publications building, it's a building he designed with a double curved roof, and it was really now it looks rather small in the context, but at the time it was a major piece of real estate, a major building that we put up with an innovative design. And Swami wanted it to be very prominent. He wanted it to become the symbol of the community, which for a long time it was. And the area where he wanted to put it happened to be the designated area where a building like that should go, where an enterprise like that should go, according to the land planning that the group of people had done for that area. But they just, as he said, he had only to suggest something, and then this group of people would organize to oppose it. So a lot of people opposed the idea of building that building there for all sorts of reasons. That it was too prominent, it should be hidden in the trees, and why do we need publications anyway, and shouldn't we just, live a quiet life here? Why are we trying to change the world? Just a whole lot of things like that. And so Swami called a meeting, and he called the meeting, and it was at the temple of the retreat where I was living. I was very, very new. We all sat in a big circle, and Swami presented his idea for the building, and he said, I rarely ask for anything specific, but when I do make a request like this, I expect it to be honored. And if you don't want to go along with me in something like this, then I will just leave. And he just made that announcement like that. And I didn't understand how sometimes people at Ananda just kind of let the energy play itself out a little bit rather than just sort of stepping in and taking a stand. Or I don't know what was going on there, but I remember sitting in that temple, and then the people who started speaking were all the people who just opposed Swami on principle. And they started just, as if he hadn't spoken, they talked about all the things that I was just saying about the birds and the trees and where buildings should go and how we should make decisions and whether we should have one person who was really making decisions, and just on and on like this. I panicked because Swami had just said if we didn't go along with him, he was going to leave. I had just moved there to be with Swamiji. He was about to leave. The way I remember it is that I just cut in and said, "Didn't you hear him? He says he's going to leave." And that's how I remember saying it, and that's what I remember saying, because that's certainly how I felt. "We don't want him to leave. What are we doing?" Like this. I didn't know anybody in the room. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know any of the oppositional people because I just never was part of their world. And somehow after I said that, a whole lot of other people started speaking in favor of what Swami was doing. And then a big group of people got up and walked out. And I think 30 or 40 people moved away from Ananda after that meeting. Now, later I talked to Swami about it, and I just, I told him how panicked I was by that. And this was my first serious lesson in leadership. Swami said, "I would never have even called the meeting," he said, "if I didn't know that I held the majority." Just like that. And I certainly would never have said anything like that if I wasn't certain that I held the majority. And that's what he says. Ever since I've taken a stronger leadership role, at the beseeching of the people who really want to work with me and work on this, everything has gone much better. And that was a big moment when he took that leadership role. So then a lot of people walked out of that meeting and walked out of the community. They mostly settled in the neighborhood. So among the reasons why we had tempestuous relations with our neighbors for a long time was part of this. And then the second time that a large group of people left was 1976, after the fire. And after 76, that whole chapter in Ananda closed. But a certain amount of it closed after that meeting in 1971. So anyway, moving along, Swami says it's absolutely essential that we be of one mind on our basic principles and directions. And we weren't until Swami really started taking a stand. Once that fundamental unity has been achieved, differences become part of a forward-moving energy, seeking new and better ways of doing things, not paralyzing all activity with endless bickering. Now that's just a huge distinction between how a group can actually work to accomplish something and whether or not a group can just go endlessly in circles. Once the essential unity of what we're doing is established, we work together for new and better ways of moving in the directions we've agreed to go, rather than just endless bickering. So, in fact, Ananda has made its greatest strides only since this kind of, quote, thinking opposition, as you call it, has been definitely and strongly rejected by the majority. So when Swami says we're going to publish books, we're going to help masters work, we want Ananda to be an example, we want the publications building to be a symbol of the community, all of those are very consistent with our basic purpose. Our basic purpose is to follow Master's ideals of a spiritual community. It's not just to build a nice home for ourselves. On the day of that fire in 1976, I was in charge of publications at that time, and long before the internet, email, anything like that, our mailing list was, the form of the mailing list was these metal plates. And they were small, like about the size of a dog tag for a military man, what you would call a dog tag, the metal thing that you is that what they call it? Yeah, that is right. The metal thing that you would wear around your neck, and it was raised, and we had a machine, and you'd just literally stamp. You'd stamp an envelope with these raised letters and an ink pad, and that was our mailing list. Those boxes of metal plates, and the way the fire burned. It burned all the hillsides, and what we call downtown Ananda, where the publications building and the market and so on are there. It was burning, from the hills coming down into the downtown. And so there was a point at which we had to try to evacuate as much as we could out of the publications building because the fire was heading right toward it, and the fire was raging at that point. And I remember, partly because I was in charge of publications, and we were running up that hill, and I remember as we were running up the hill to go and retrieve what we could retrieve, I said to Seva, who was running next to me, we were in our 20s, bear in mind, and we could run uphill. I said, the first thing we have to get is the mailing list, because if this place burns down, we're going to need help rebuilding it. It was just like, even in that moment, there was no question in my mind that this fire would defeat us. We were going to have to go on, and we would need help. So that mailing list would just melt, and then how would we contact people? So the first thing we had to get out was that. By that point, trucks had gotten up, and we were throwing things in trucks. And when we took things in order, we took, again, the originals of the books, all the tape recordings that we could take, as much book inventory as we could, the mailing list, everything essential to be able to keep going with the outreach. And that was, we had a printing press. We had our own printing press up there at that time. I remember pushing on the printing press. I was told later it weighed about 5,000 pounds, just to see whether enough of us could carry that thing out, because it was pretty darn expensive. But I also remember somebody several people were going to carry this copy machine out. In those days, they were much smaller. I said, just leave it, it's rented. It doesn't belong to us, let it burn. It wasn't that I wouldn't have taken it, but I wanted to take everything else that we couldn't replace first. But that was how we felt about it. We were there for the vision of what we were going to do, and there was a unified principle. And there were lots of disagreements. People at Ananda are incredibly self-willed. But we had a basic unity. It was just how we were going to get there, not where we were going. So he says, in fact, Ananda has made, yes, I've said that. He was talking about how thinking opposition, as you call it, has been definitely and strongly rejected by the majority. It will continue to be rejected. Now, I just want to remind you that Swami's actually writing this letter to this woman, and he started the letter, which I read last week, about saying, I know that you're sincere and that you're a very good person, and you wrote to me thoughtfully, so I'm going to really answer you. And so Swami's really answering her. He's not mincing words. He wanted her to understand, and it will continue to be rejected. Now, one has to take the trouble to understand what the, quote, thinking opposition was really like, and the kind of, negative energy effect it had on Ananda. It was just as simple as that. Swami's not being authoritarian. He's being realistic. He's being practical in his idealism. He's just knowing that it's not going to work. That kind of energy does not bring success. And if he was going to be successful, he had to stand against it. And he never hesitated to take a stand when he knew it was necessary. And it will continue to be rejected. We don't need that kind of energy, and the vast majority here are no longer willing to put up with it. Again and again lately, I have heard constructive workers in the community express their determination not to have their efforts paralyzed any longer by the small negative element which owes its negativity not to any intrinsic darkness of character. Most of them are good people. If they weren't, they wouldn't even be here. But only to the fact that it can't accept for itself the directions in which Ananda is moving. And so there is the whole point of it. Ananda has a destiny. It's beginning to express that destiny, and it's not what this group of people thought it was going to be or want it to be. And so they're standing against it because they have a different idea. Not because they're evil or dark or because their ideas are bad. They're just different. I mean, bad in the sense of wrong, not wholesome. Their ideas were fine. They were just different. Ananda is very, very specific in its destiny. Now all of that is obvious. It was obvious to some of us even then, but now it's self-evident. What you and others want is, I'm sure, perfectly fine in itself. You are entitled to feel disappointed in Ananda if it isn't giving you what you want. All I can say is that Ananda has demonstrated an unusual capacity for survival in the direction it has taken that I don't think it would have survived had it taken any of several alternative directions that have been proposed to it from time to time. And that I hope and expect someday to be able to accommodate people who are less interested in community involvement than they now need to be if Ananda is to remain viable. So once again, Swami is saying it's not that your ideas are inherently undesirable. It's just if this project is going to succeed, this is what is required. Swami also knew that this community was dedicated to Master, and it was just going to have to be built in a certain way, consistent with his inspiration. And if it didn't, it wouldn't succeed. Swami's statement that it wouldn't have succeeded was also just practical, because he understands how human dynamic works. But it was also spiritual in the sense that this community is destined to be Master's community, and if we veer away from that, then we won't have his grace, and his grace is what's made it a success. Now, to some of the other points you have raised. So Swami's answered that in general. He's talking about, now we're going to come into a discussion of a particular man whose name is Jim. I mentioned him in Light Bearer. He was a very strong personality that Swami did a great deal to try to win, meaning to inspire, to be in tune with what he was trying to do. He's a disciple of Master and has remained a disciple of Master, but he was very active and stirred up a lot of energy. Whenever he took a stand, he stirred up a lot of energy, and he chose to take a rather negative stand, especially towards Swami, and remained so for decades afterwards. He was a strong, outspoken critic. And so to your statement about Jim, quote, a man you fear or dislike enough to send negative energy to leave the community, unquote. That's a quote from her letter. You should know that when this man did leave the community, Swami said later that he had suggested to Divine Mother that it would be a good idea if this man left. And then he did leave, and that fact became known. Please know first that far from fearing and disliking Jim, I sincerely like him, and probably always will like him. He has many wonderful qualities. I truly hoped when he came that he and I would become good friends. By his own discovery, however, he does not belong in Ananda's present situation, for it seems to him to require more sacrifice of his time and energy than he feels he can spare from his family. I remember in reading that was one of the conflicts between some of the people who were the thinking opposition, is that a number of them were raising children, and they felt that the community ought to make more allowances for their family life, whereas Swami himself says that this just happens to be a time when we don't have that margin. You just don't survive if you don't have the luxury. Everybody has to be all hands on deck all the time. And it was true. And that was one of the reasons why the core of the community was monastic, because monastic people didn't need any personal time, or very little, beyond meditation. But we didn't have relationships to maintain. We didn't have children to raise. Whereas couples with children often felt that a conflict between what was needed by the community and what they felt was needed by their family. So, by his own discovery, he has discovered that he doesn't belong in Ananda's present situation, for he wants to devote more time to his personal life than the demands of the community will allow. I mean, that's not an evil wish, but if it's a conflict, it is a conflict. Unfortunately, he has so little confidence in his own directions that he feels a need to constantly justify them by soliciting others' agreement and support. He talked to many people here about his own personal needs in such a way as to leave them feeling, to quote their own words, depressed and discouraged. I pleaded with Jim once or twice not to infect others with his negative thoughts, Negative, that is to say, from the standpoint of what he himself is doing, which is his downward pulling energy. But it was not possible for him to desist. I therefore found myself wishing strongly that he would leave Ananda. You may call this negative energy, inasmuch as I do seem to have a strong mind. But in fact, my thoughts were directed towards him only insofar as he was putting out energies that were harmful to the general welfare and harmony of Ananda. Had he changed the quality of those energies, my thoughts would have ceased to affect him, for they were not directed towards him personally. That's a very interesting point. If he had changed the nature of his energy, my thoughts would not have affected him, because Swami's energy was not directed to the person. He was directed to the energy that the person was putting out. And if the person stopped putting out that kind of energy, then those thoughts would never have come to him. I mean, Swami's energy wouldn't have reached him in the same way, because it wasn't personal. This is a hard thing to understand with Swamiji. He did like this man. He was a very likable man. But he had some bad habits. And Swami puts it, he had so little confidence in his own directions. You see, these are very interesting phrases, that he had to just constantly go around and try to solicit support from everyone, get everyone to agree with him, instead of just knowing where he stood and what he should do. Now, nor is it being negative to try to prevent negativity. The most positive thing Jim could have done is what he is now actually planning to do, which is leave Ananda and go in his own preferred direction. My wish that he leave, therefore, was also for his own benefit, not for his harm, because it wasn't good to be opposing. You can't stay in something that you don't support and then try to undermine the support that others have for it. It's not a wholesome way to spend your time. You say in your letter, this woman, he's writing to her again, quote, "We all know that Master gives us what we need." Swami replies, yes and no. He does give us what we need if we work for it. He doesn't if we don't. And so that's, these are again where people use these platitudes. Master will give us what he needs. Swami said he was on such the horns of a dilemma in the early years, because he was living in San Francisco and then for a while in Sacramento, teaching classes every night of the week to earn the money to put up the buildings and to pay the mortgage. And in the meantime, people were moving to the community. Jyotish was already in place. He was helping to lead the community in Swami's stead. And Devi, Jaya, Benai, Shivani, Satya, a lot of early founding members came right at the very beginning. But there was also this large group of people who had this other point of view, like Master will provide, God will provide. And Swami knew that God wouldn't provide if they were the only energy there, so he had to work hard to pay the mortgage. So they would spend their time communing with nature and swimming in the river, and then see the mortgage was paid every month. And they actually saw it as a sign that their point of view and their response to life was actually appropriate. But Swami couldn't stop paying the mortgage. But it was a bitter pill to swallow at times. So, much of what Ananda was, that all these people loved, was created by Swami and then by others of us who sort of picked up a laboring oar and really put our will behind making it succeed. And then as they saw it develop, they felt justified. So, if we work for it, he does, and if we don't, he doesn't. People used to think Master would pay our mortgage without their having to dirty their hands with the crassness of money-making, but he didn't. I myself saved the farm from foreclosure by the very skin of its teeth, a disaster that threatened simply because of many members' impractical and unrealistic, in fact, unspiritual attitude. Master has blessed us because we've done what we could on our own to build Ananda and to make it secure. These are very, very important leadership teachings here. One thing more I should say, out of fairness to those working so dedicatedly here, and also out of kindness to those who so sincerely want to live a spiritual life, but who think spiritual living means just doing one's own thing. The Bhagavad Gita stresses the need for sacrifice, tyaga. I've observed over the years that those who pitched in selflessly and served the community have grown spiritually. All too often, however, those who, from whatever reason, withdrew from this attitude have gotten out of tune, have given up meditation, have ceased even from attending any spiritual activity, and have shown in their eyes an inner loss, which suggests strongly that it isn't for spiritual reasons that they have withdrawn their energies, regardless of how they might define their own reasons to themselves and their friends. Swami said this over and over and over and over again. He said he saw that those who gave selflessly always grew, and those who said, well, let me get my own little scene together and then I'll help someone else. He said it never worked. It just never worked that way. I say this kindly and with deep concern. And I don't say it personally with you in mind. He's writing to this particular woman. For I haven't seen you enough in recent months to form such an impression about you. But this, therefore, because a lot of people came and they thought they called themselves disciples or they were serious on the path. And they would meditate for a while and participate and serve and then just gradually stop doing it. And they all had good reasons, but what it was is they stopped doing it. And so their energy just started going in another direction, because we were a community of a certain kind. But this, therefore, is the direction we at Ananda shall keep moving in. I am aware that there are other good ways of living, and I earnestly plead with anyone who doesn't like what Ananda is doing, that he follows some more desirable and perhaps even better alternative. Ananda has had more than its share of thinking opposition. Always it has found it corrosive, not stimulating. Again, very important leadership principles. Now Ananda wants to grow harmoniously, constructively, with those differences rather that occur among brothers and sisters and not among antagonists. Much is happening at Ananda. In many ways it is already the great community that you spoke of so wistfully. I would like to think you could be a part of its further growth. If you and your husband should leave, as I understand you are planning to do, our gratitude will go with you for the good that you have done here. You have won friends here, one of whom is myself. I respect and I love you both. I plead with you only, for your own sakes, to support mentally and not oppose the good that is happening here. It would not be good karma for you to denigrate Ananda merely because it was not what you wanted. That's an important point that we've always had trouble with. People leave it. Swami says, most people either come to Ananda and stay, or they stay for a while and then they leave. And they consider it to be an interesting or an enjoyable or an instructive interlude in their lives. And then Swami used this phrase, something like, but there are others for whom Ananda has such a profound effect that they can never fully leave it behind them, but constantly have to justify their departure. And the way they justify their departure is to make Ananda wrong. And Swami Kriyananda sometimes is the leader of it, because to make Swami wrong, because if Swami wasn't wrong, then they would have been wrong. And so it's a hard issue. This is all written in 1974. So 50 years now Ananda's been in existence. These seem a little quaint, but they were very real issues, and they're leadership issues for anybody who tries to launch a project. So, it would not be good karma for you to denigrate Ananda. Swami almost never says that. He just, he doesn't want to curse people. It would not be good karma for you to denigrate Ananda merely because it was not what you wanted. Bless it, and then if you must, leave. Stay if you feel that you can. I think you would grow by the association if you could accept it as it is, not as you might like it to be. But in any case, please remember your own words. If you are doing Master's will, then may my eyes be open soon. I repeat the same prayer for myself. If I am not doing His will, may my eyes be open soon. But I tell you this, I am sincerely and honestly trying to do His will. And I cannot but think that even if you reject everything I've written in this letter, if you keep it and read it a few months or years from now, you may feel differently about what we've been doing here and about what we are doing. And that's sort of, one gets caught up in these flows of energy and feels very committed to things. But then I've certainly found that experience. You read a letter you wrote or someone wrote to you a long time later and you think, this is so different than the way I felt it at the time. Because our emotions are just very impressive and how they sweep us over and confuse our feelings and our logic. At any rate, in the belief that you are truly sincere, and though I know your present circumstances may militate against openness to Ananda's prevailing point of view, I have taken the time to write you at such length, and with deep love and affection for you both, in Master's love. Very nice letter. Because I don't know who was there, undoubtedly the person continued to depart from Ananda, and I have no idea who they are, so I don't know what their destiny was. Okay, here's another one. This one was written to Oliver Black. Oliver Black, Master said that of the men disciples, Rajarsi Janakananda was the first in realization, and Mr. Oliver Black was the second. Oliver Black never lived at Mount Washington. He lived in Michigan. He was a self-made man, just like Rajarsi was. He was a very wealthy man. For some reason, I want to say in the automobile industry, but I'm not sure. But he was a very wealthy man, and he was also a yogi. And as I said, he was a self-made man. He was a very strong soul. He never lived at Mount Washington, but he remained associated with Self-Realization Fellowship, and therefore, because of the disagreement, because of the negative feeling towards Swamiji from the leadership of SRF at that time, Oliver Black never made a close association with Swami, although Oliver Black lived more independently because he lived in Michigan and he started his own work there, but he did it more under the banner of SRF, and therefore he never became close with Ananda. At this time, it's 1988, Mr. Black wrote to Swami, and this is the summary here. It says, at the age of 90, Mr. Black wrote to Swami Kriyananda asking for advice on how to turn the ashram he had founded into a true World Brotherhood colony. He bought property in Michigan, and it's called Song of the Morning Ranch. I believe it's still there. And he ran it as an ashram and as a retreat. But he had the vision in his mind of what Swami Kriyananda had created at Ananda Village, where there would be householders and children and so on like that. So Mr. Black writes to Swami for advice. Mr. Black is 90 years old. His name was, Master called him Yogacharya, which means teachers of yoga. Dear Yogacharya Oliver, thank you for your welcome letter. I am impressed by your courage in, quote, working diligently, unquote, at this late time in your life to create a colony. More power to you. What we have at Ananda now is a real village with lovely homes, flourishing businesses, schools that have an excellent reputation, and an experiment in living that people in many countries admire. We have several branch communities also, including one near Assisi, Italy. By 88 now, we were 20 years old. We were celebrating our founding date as 1968 at that time. It fluctuated for a number of years and then finally was settled on 69. Far more important, we have about 500 devotees who are living joyously for God and Master, who meditate several hours daily and are dedicated to making Master's message of self-realization known everywhere. See, that was success for Swami. We had to make the physical place because we need physical places in order to have the satsang, to have the support to be able to live a truly spiritual life, to be able to work cooperatively, to do the work that Master has given us to do. Physical places are not incidental to Master's work. I mean, nowadays when we can do so much online and all of these sorts of things, sometimes people lose track of the fact that living together in spiritual community is what gives us individually and collectively the power to do this work. And even if the work at the present moment, because this is being recorded in 2021, early 2021, when we're still a little bit trapped by the COVID virus, but what gives us the power to be able to do all this online work is the core of energy that's created by being able to live in spiritual community. That's a physical place. It requires that. If all of us who are gathered together making all of this happen in a broader sense, we're scattered individually in random apartments or houses all over the area, a tremendous amount of the magnetism that gives this work its power would be dissipated. I say it wouldn't be dissipated for long because we just find a way to get back together. But nonetheless, it's very important to realize that. But more important than the physical place is the spiritual result of having the physical place. And it's the spiritual result, that's why we do it. In the path, somewhere Swami talks about, just in this materialistic age, when so much militates against a serious spiritual life, those of us who, well, just as Master put it, those of you who share high ideals need to band together. We need each other's support because otherwise our energy is just dissipated by the all-pervasive worldliness. Or our idea of what is spiritual life, it begins to dissolve a little bit. And if we're just like sort of not as materialistic as our worst neighbors, then we think that we're being pretty spiritual. We just lose track of our own potential. But when like-minded people are gathered together on a daily basis of satsang, then the power can really grow. As you can see, I feel quite passionately about it, but it's important. Okay. But when I think of the struggle of our beginnings, now we're 20 years into it, in the time this letter's written, not so much of our initial poverty, nor of how simply we had to live. That all had its compensations. I love the way he says that, because that's how I feel too. Being poor and living so simply, that was actually quite wonderful. I often wonder if I could go back to that. I like to think that I could. We'll see. I'll see if I'm tested, if I'm given the opportunity. But that has its compensations. But of the problems I faced in bringing so many people into attunement with Master's ideals, that was really the project for him, bringing people into attunement with Master's ideals. Swami says, I tell myself, once was enough. Patience and determinations are virtues, but there are other qualities also that one needs to work on the spiritual path. Patience and determination, that was what those early years were like for Swami. He held the vision, he persevered patiently and with determination. Most of our real difficulties at the beginning seemed to be related to people. True, there were money worries. At first I had to go out and earn most of what we needed myself. True, also, there were times when it looked as if financial disaster not only stared us in the face, but was preparing to swallow us. But Master always wrought the necessary miracles. In one case, saving our most important, in fact, essential property, with only 24 hours to spare. I've always believed that one essential reason we won out was that we always held to the Indian motto, where there is dharma, there is victory. That is the absolute truth. No matter how tough it got, we never compromised. Another reason we won was that we held to Master's dictate. Be practical in your idealism. And that is something that, it's just, I'm so glad that Swami puts it there, because that's what, that's what the previous letter to a large extent was all about. Was the woman who wrote to Swami that he was answering at such length, just sort of had these airy ideas about how things ought to operate. But they weren't grounded in actual real-life experience, and they weren't based on the knowledge of what is required to really launch such an imaginative and ambitious project as Ananda. You have to be practical about it. You can't be all things to all people. You can't please everybody. You can't have the worst complainer. You can't spend all your time getting the thinking opposition to agree with you. Sometimes you just have to move on with your positive energy and just let the chips fall where they may. And Swami was asked once how much of Ananda was a compromise from what he imagined. And his response was, you don't want to know. You just don't want to know how much. One of the most interesting things to me is, and this was from the very beginning, Swami wanted Ananda to have a cohesive architecture. Most of us were very young, and most of us had really traveled very little, whereas Swamiji grew up in Europe. He was fluent in 3 languages. Let's see, it would be Romanian, English, German, French, 4 languages by the time he was 10. And he just saw a world that most of us had never seen. And he'd seen these wonderful European villages where there is a cohesive architecture, a general style of building, a general unity of building materials, roof lines, roofing, and so on. And they made such a charming picture of a village. That Swami's idea for Ananda village had been to create something that looked like a village. He absolutely got nowhere with people on that. We're Americans, we build our houses the way we want to build them, whatever it was. And it just sort of went up especially then, in a super hodgepodge fashion. And I remember at a certain point, Swami just sort of looking at it and saying, well, I think the only thing to do now is plant a lot of trees. And it was such an essential point. And when you think about it now, it's so self-evident. Of course, we should build in a way that has an architectural unity that will make a statement. But he even on such an essential point, he couldn't win, and so he just let it go. Because if he got the spirit right, everything would follow. And that's really, those are the points on which he would say, well, it's just a form. He wouldn't say, well, it's just a form in terms of having a community. That's more than a form. That's a gathering of energy that makes everything possible. But on the architecture of the buildings, well, it is just a form. And if the spirit is right, then everything else will follow. But he had to give up a lot. That's all I'll say. More than, I have no idea how much more. But that was certainly part of it. And the third reason, Swami says, for our success, after where there's dharma, there's victory, be practical in your idealism, was people are more important than things. And that was always the way Ananda was run. Swami never said, oh, we're going to do this project, we're going to do that project. Swami would have an idea, but if there wasn't, as the way he often put it, if there wasn't a person who was available to see the project through, for whom it would be spiritually beneficial to do that work, then Swami would always put the project aside, no matter how important it might be. Even at one point, there was a department, a creative arts department that Swami had worked years to really come into focus, and it was really beginning to create and work very well. But unfortunately, the man in charge became enamored of the personal opportunities that his position gave him. He took advantage of those opportunities in ways that were not dharmic. Swami heard about it in the morning, and in the afternoon the department was closed. Period. Stopped. Swami said, I would rather lose everything than do something that's not in keeping with dharma. And that was just, and it was a great personal disappointment for Swamiji, because he had really devoted years, literally, of effort to bring the project to that point. But there was no question. There was just no question. It was just, it had to go. And it was bad for the individual who was misusing his position also. And Swami felt, as an act of friendship, he needed to save him from a temptation that was more than he could resist. So that is, we really, Swami's never compromised on that. Even in the matter of practicality, however, my big challenge came from people. From those woolly-minded idealists, woolly-minded, that's the phrase Swami used, woolly-minded idealists, for example, who insisted they were serving God by going to the river and swimming all day, instead of working to earn anything so crass as money. I knew I'd never build a successful community if I simply laid down the law to them. I had to learn how to win them and not drive them to right action. That was Swami's way always, magnetism. Communication, magnetism. However, in the previous letter, we also see that there would be a point where Swami would take a stand. And he wouldn't lay down the law in the sense of, you must do this, but he made it very clear as to what Ananda was doing, and then people had to make a choice. You see, there's a slight difference there, and that was how Swami did it. Like that man who was so unsupportive for so many years, it wasn't that we asked him to leave, it was that he was told that he really ought to contribute as others were contributing. And so he had a choice, and he made it. The main principle that I found worked was perhaps to work in cooperation with positive and supportive energy, and not to waste time and energy on those people who are either passive drifters or negative opponents. When I had to take up responsibility for developing what has become the community here in Palo Alto, one of the really important pieces of advice that Swami gave us was work with people, work with the positive people. Give most of your energy to those who are most able to respond in a cooperative, harmonious way, and to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish. He said many leaders waste all their time trying to convert the negative people. He said, just don't bother, it will take care of itself. He said, build the positive core, and the positive core of energy will increase the magnetic force, the vortex of positive energy, and those who are peripheral will either get drawn in or spun out, is the way he put it. And that's, over many years, I found that to be absolutely true. It's not that in any way one is unkind to people who really aren't in tune with what you're trying to do. Many such people are very nice and interesting friends. But if they're not in tune with what we're trying to do, we can't spend a lot of time trying to get them in tune, because then you never have any power. And I mean power in the sense of magnetism and the kind of team effort that'll really make something happen in the world. He uses the phrase, instead of wasting time and energy on those who are either passive drifters, is also, in the spiritual world, there's a lot of passive drifters. people who are eclectic and who like this, and they've taken initiation from 3 or 4 other ashrams, and they spend a while here and they've studied that. But they don't take hold. They're drifting, passive drifters. It's a marvelous phrase. Such people, as I said, there's nothing to dislike, but you're not going to be able to build the kind of community that Master envisioned, where people are clear and dedicated to what they're doing and are willing to discipline themselves to put out the energy, or negative oppositionists, people who just don't like authority and spend all their time trying to persuade you that you ought to be different. Everything that Swami said to me about people and leaders, I've subsequently experienced it. When he was telling me, much of the time I didn't really know. But then later on, when I had those experiences, oh yeah, I remember Swami talked about this. Here it is, and these people are acting out the very script that he told me would happen. And I therefore knew how to respond. In the beginning, our core group of dedicated members was quite small, and the opposition to every constructive idea dauntingly large. Negative energy, however, has no cohesive power. This is a phrase that Swami would often say. Negative energy is not cohesive. I mean, by its very nature, it's not cohesive, because people are more inclined to be oppositional than to be unified. So a lot of times, even though can be a lot of negative energy, it tends not to be cohesive. That's the actual word. So even though the core group was small and the oppositional energy was larger, the core group was cohesive. It was in tune with itself. It was strong in its commitment. And usually the negative in this situation were just all over the map. Negative energy has no cohesive power if one can afford to give it time to disprove itself. What it feeds on, and what gives negativity strength, is the feeling that it has something substantial to oppose. Usually, therefore, at least where possible, I more or less ignored the negative voices and just worked around them. Meaning, don't take a stand against them, because then they'll take a stand against you. Swami just sort of finessed it. He just let them do what they were going to do, let them talk to each other, and he just worked around it. He just went forward with what he was trying to do, rather than feeling that he had to stand up to them until, like that one meeting when I talked about, when he knew he had the majority. He chose his battles extremely carefully. So, when I had to fight them, I made sure in advance that I had the backing or the power within myself to win. And that's also super important. It's just like a leader can't afford to take a public stand and lose. Because it's not only that you lose the issue, but people begin to think that they can overpower you, and your own side loses faith in you. So you don't take a public stand unless you know that you have the support. Like I was saying about that meeting, Swami said, I would never have said that, but I knew that the majority of people in the room were with me. And he wouldn't have done it any sooner because he didn't really have that support. Let's see, there was one more part of that. Let me find it. No, I'll just let it go for the moment. Or the other part of it is, or the power within myself to win. It's very interesting. For even small defeats can loom large in petty minds and can seriously damage a leader's position in the future. Patient determination, those are the words Swami used. Best is it, I learned, in the likelihood of defeat, to give in quickly and gracefully and rescue what one can for the next time around. Don't prolong the fight if you know you're going to lose. Give in quickly and gracefully. In other words, don't give. Negative energy will coalesce if it feels that it has a strong force that it can oppose. So you don't want to give it a strong force. If people are really determined in a certain direction, give in gracefully and quickly, and then just go on. Fortunately, for many years now, those people problems have been overcome. The harmony here now is so great that I rarely have to involve myself in the day-to-day running of things, except essentially from behind the scenes. You know, people just, as he said on different times, the energy is right, and people are making good decisions, so there's just no point in his being involved. But he was greatly involved in the sense that he had continuous satsang with the people who had responsibility. So they were always exercising their responsibilities, having been infused with his vibration and consciousness. So he was influencing everything without having to do it directly. The most important factor in our success, certainly, has been the fact that every day since our beginnings, I have given this whole project to Master and have asked him to do with it as he would, albeit through our own physical struggles. And that's the point that Swami made in the other letter. No, Master won't provide if you don't put out the energy. And so we give it to Master, we ask him to do what he will with it, but we're not passive in that. We're not passive drifters. We put both hands on the plow and we go into the field and work long hours every day through our efforts, but Master's will. I say these things in a spirit of sharing, he's writing to Oliver Black, since you asked me, and not of giving advice. Swami was a junior disciple to Oliver. It would have been presumptuous, but Oliver asked, and Swami had been successful. He was the only disciple who built a community. A Master wanted them, and Swami was the one who did it, so it was appropriate that Oliver should ask him. I know you have succeeded greatly in the business world, and that you must know much of what I've had to learn here through years of struggle, and perhaps a great deal more besides. So Swamiji's being very generous to Oliver, because Oliver was, as I said, was a self-made wealthy man, and energy is energy, and people are people. So it's quite possible that Oliver was quite skilled in all of this. But it's interesting, you know, at the age of 90, Oliver asks, what are the keys to Ananda's success? And these are the points that Swami feels to raise. But let me send you also another book I wrote, and one that grew out of the lessons I learned in working with people. It's called The Art of Supportive Leadership. I'll also send you a book on Ananda, Cities of Light. You may have these books already, in which case you may find use for these extra copies anyway. Swami's so gracious. He didn't want to put Oliver in a bad spot. You know, here I'm sending you my books. Maybe you already have them. Maybe you can give them to others. He didn't want Oliver to feel indebted in any way. Swami says, we celebrated our 20th anniversary this year. Please give us your blessings for a continued future of joyful service to Master and to God in Master's love. You know, one of the great tapasyas of Swami's life, his whole life, was that when he was separated from Self-Realization Fellowship in 1962, he lost the company of his peers. And he lost the company of those who had shared the most significant experience of his life, which was to have known Master. And I didn't really cognize this until a long time later. I wasn't aware enough of anything to be able to really see what that meant. But in 1993, when we celebrated Master's 100th birth anniversary, we gathered a few disciples, they came to Ananda Village, direct disciples. His name escapes me at the moment, that he actually took over for Oliver Black. Bob Raymer, Betsy, Dietz, Peggy Dietz, Bob Raymer, Peggy Dietz, Roy Eugene Davis, Hari Krishna Ghosh, Hare Krishna was only 15. He's Master's nephew, and when Master went back to India in 1935, Hare Krishna was 15 years old, but he did have a year and a half with Guru directly. But Bob Raymer, Roy Davis, and Peggy Dietz had shared Swami's experience. And when I saw Swami with those people, and how they, unlike any of the rest of us, had been there, and they knew what it had been like to be with Master. And we all loved Master and attuned to him in our own way, but we just didn't share that experience. And when I saw Swamiji with people who shared that experience, I realized, oh my gosh, how much he lost in just committing himself to do this work and committing himself to us. We were all good friends to him, but we just were not part of that. So having Oliver write to Swamiji, I remember when it happened, Swami was so touched by it. He was also so touched that at the age of 90, Oliver was setting out on a project that was so enormous, but he admired that spirit. And these are the things that he thought were relevant to tell Oliver, which really also encapsulates, in a very real sense, Swami explaining how and why he did it and what he considers to be the success of Ananda. So my friends, that will be our evening. God bless you all.